As I told you in the last lesson, quite often we use visual diff tools for comparing files. There's so many visual diff tools out there. The most popular ones are KDiff and P4Merge, which are cross-platform, and WinMerge that runs only on Windows. In this lesson, I'm going to show you how to use VS Code for comparing files. If you want to use a different tool or a different editor, you have to look up the instructions yourself. So here in the terminal, first we have to tell Git that we want to use VS Code as our default diff tool. So we have to set two configuration settings. So once again, we type git config -- global. So the global settings apply to all of our repositories, okay? Now the setting we're going to set is diff.tool. We're going to set that to VS Code. So with this command, we're just giving a name, in this case VS Code, to our default diff tool. Next, we need to tell Git how to launch VS Code. So once again, git config -- global. Here we set diff tool dot VS Code dot CMD. We set this to double quotes because we're going to have a space. Now on my machine, I've added code to my path so I can run it from any directories. If this doesn't work on your machine, you have to look up the instructions yourself depending on your operating system. So we're going to launch code with a few arguments. The first one is -- wait. This tells the terminal window to wait until we're done with VS Code. So until we have compared the changes and closed the VS Code instance. The second argument is -- This tells VS Code that we want to use it for diffing or comparing files. Then we have two more arguments, $local in capital and $remote in capital. These are placeholders for the old and new copies of a file, okay? So let's set that. Now let's make sure that you have got this step right. So we're going to run git config -- global -e. As I told you at the beginning of the course, with this command, we can edit our global configuration settings in our default editor, which is VS Code. So take a look. So all the settings are stored in this file, .getConfig, which is stored in this directory. So we have the user section, which we set earlier in the course. Now here's the diff section that we just set. In this section, we have set the tool to VS Code. This is just a name. Then we have diff tool, VS Code. And here's the command that should be run for comparing files with VS Code. So we have code with -- wait, then -- diff. Now those two placeholders that I added, for some reason they're lost. So let's add them real quick. $local and $remote. Make sure to get this right, otherwise things are not going to work on your machine. Now we're done. So let's close this window. Back in the terminal, instead of using the diff command, we're going to use diff tool. This will launch our visual diff tool for comparing files. Now, if we don't supply any arguments, we're going to see our on-state changes. So this will compare what we have in the working directory with what we have in the staging area. If you want to look at our state changes, we supply -- stage, exactly the same way we use the diff command, okay? So let's look at the changes we have in our working directory. We have modified only a single file. That is why we have 1 out of 1, and that is file1.js. So Git is asking if you want to launch VS Code, which is the name that we assigned to our default diff tool. Let's go ahead. Take a look. So here's the old copy, which is what we have in the staging area, and here's a new copy, which is what we have in the working directory. As you can see, we can easily tell that this line has been replaced with this line. It's much easier to see the changes. Now the terminal window is waiting for us to close the VS Code instance. So let's close this window. Back to the terminal. Now let's look at the state changes. So git diff tool -- staged. Two files have been affected in the staging area. The first one is file1.js. Let's look at the changes. All right, in this case, the old copy is what we have in the last commit, and the new copy is what we have in the staging area. So these are the changes that are going to go in the next commit. You can easily tell that we have added 2 lines here. Now let's close this tab. Back in the terminal, Git is asking if you want to look at the changes in file2.js. In this case, I'm going to ignore that, so no. Quite honestly, we don't use diff tools so much these days. I just covered it because I want my course to be comprehensive. These days, most editors and IDEs allow us to view the staged and unstaged changes as part of our development environment. I will show you how to do this later in this section.